Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome. This is the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative's webinar alongside Blumont, Colombia and the Syrian Refugee Life Study. We're so excited to have you join us today for a presentation on the connections between housing and self-reliance for displaced populations and presenting emerging evidence from Jordan and Colombia. As a bit of an introduction, the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative, or the RSRI, is a global network of now over 400 organizations working to advance self-reliance globally through programs, policy, and evidence. And part of this is building the evidence base around what works to facilitate self-reliance along the many different domains that encompass self-reliance. So for the purpose of this webinar, we'll be looking at adequate housing, which is a foundational element for self-reliance among displaced populations, yet it remains underemphasized in both humanitarian and development programs. So today, we will explore this emerging evidence and how these programs have affected broader domains of self-reliance, such as psychosocial well-being, safety, integration, and economic resilience. We'll hear from the Syrian Refugee Life Study on a randomized control trial of housing subsidies for Syrian refugees in Jordan. And we will also hear from Blumont in Colombia, who conducted 2 quasi-experimental impact evaluations on rental support for IDPs and migrants with over 15,000 beneficiaries in Colombia. With that, I will go ahead and introduce our 2 speakers for today. So first, we will hear from Abed Tamim, who is a PhD candidate in economics at UC Berkeley, where he researches policy-relevant challenges in developing economies using empirical methods grounded in economic theory. Abed's work leverages granular data sets, including satellite data and administrative records, to study scarce resource allocation, agricultural productivity, and the welfare effects of social policies such as housing subsidies. Prior to Berkeley, Abed earned a master's in agricultural economics from McGill University and a bachelor's in economics with distinction from the American University of Beirut. He also served as a consultant at the World Bank, contributing to policies focused on forcibly displaced populations in Kenya and Jordan. And then after that, we'll hear from Juan Pablo Franco Jiménez, who is the country director of Blumont in Colombia. He joined Blumont in 2012 and has led the implementation of programs to improve humanitarian assistance and durable solutions for internally displaced persons, and to promote self-reliance and social integration of Venezuelan refugees and migrants in host communities in Colombia. Before joining Blumont, Juan Pablo worked for 7 years for the government of Colombia with conflict-affected communities, and he is an industrial engineer and a political scientist, and he holds a summa cum laude master's degree in public affairs from Sciences Po in France. So very excited to have these 2 guests today to share this emerging evidence. And if any of our guests and audience would like to introduce yourselves in the chat, we'd love to also know who is with us today. Please go ahead and share your name, organization, location. And then as these presentations unfold, if you have any questions, you can place them in the chat, or we will have some time for Q&A after each of the presentations and then during our longer discussion afterwards to be able to answer your questions. So please do share your questions. We'd love to hear from you. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Abed and the Syrian Refugee Life Study for their presentation with evidence emerging from Jordan. Over to you, Abed.
Okay, thank you so much, Ali, and thanks for the Refugee Reliance team and everyone for their time. And thank you so much for the audience for presenting. So today I'll be sharing with you, along with my colleague Mansi, some evidence from our RCT in Jordan. And this is kind of a work that's been kind of in progress with so many amazing colleagues that you can see here, and some of them are on the call. But before that, I'm just going to turn to my colleague Mansi, who's going to tell you a little bit about the Syrian Refugee Life Study in general. And then I'm going to come back and tell you in particular about our.
Great, thank you, Abed. Hi, everyone. It's nice to hear from you. My name is Mansi. I'm a research manager at the Center for Effective Global Action, SIGA, housed at UC Berkeley, and I manage the Syrian Refugee Life Study. Like Abed said, I'll just give a brief overview of the project and some exciting next steps before handing it back to Abed to discuss the results of our study. So, the Syrian Refugee Life Study, or S-RLS for short, has two primary components. First is the RCT, which is what we will be discussing today. And this RCT evaluated a housing subsidy program for Syrian refugees in Jordan, where landlords received funds from our implementing partner in order to provide reduced rent to refugees. And I'll let Abed speak to the specifics of the intervention in just a moment. The second component of the study is a longitudinal panel study, and this has been running since 2020 and collected 6 rounds of very comprehensive data on employment, consumption, marriage, fertility, child outcomes, intentions to return, predictions of future conflict. It's quite comprehensive. And coincidentally, our team collected data in November 2024, about 2 weeks before the collapse of the Assad regime. So we have very unique data on refugee return intentions. And all of this data is publicly available via the Harvard Dataverse, and we really encourage researchers to check this out. And this brings me to some exciting new steps that we're hoping to undertake. So we are actively adapting our project to a post-Assad climate and pursuing 3 primary trajectories. First, we want to continue building out the panel and focusing on returns. So we're very well poised to be understanding the drivers of return because we've been collecting this information since 2020, like I said, and we're very excited to be building out the panel within Syria more broadly. We'll be undertaking a round of data collection beginning in this November, and this will be the first time that we'll be collecting data within Syria, and we hope to continue expanding out that panel for years to come. The second thing that we'd like to do is undertake new impact evaluations. So as multilaterals and different organizations begin resuming their work within Syria, as policymakers begin implementing new policies, this is a really opportune window to start new studies for the first time within Syria. And we can actively measure their impact from the ground up. So we're very excited to be actively scoping out some partnerships to hopefully start some new impact evaluations. And lastly, we're very interested in creating a fellowship program actually for Syrian returnees. So as I mentioned earlier, SIGA is housed at UC Berkeley, and we have been hosting semester-long research fellowships for about 12 years. And we have really strong infrastructure to create very policy-relevant curriculum that we would be excited to tailor to Syria specifically. So this could be a really unique opportunity for newly minted government officials or returning researchers to gain critical skills, network, strengthen their understanding of policymaking as they return to Syria. And of course, we can't do any of this work on our own, so we're very actively seeking out new partners to collaborate in this work. My contact information will be on the last slide, and I'll drop it in the chat right now, so please do not hesitate to contact me if you're interested in speaking further about any of these opportunities. But for now, I will pass it back to Abed to talk more specifically about the results of our RCT. Thanks, Abed.
Thank you so much, Mansi. That's great. And now I would be kind of going into the study on the randomized experiment for the housing subsidy in particular. So let's just get into it. So what is the program that I'll be telling you about today? So it's a housing subsidy program. Some of you might be familiar with the US context of the Moving to Opportunity program. This one is kind of similar in spirit, but different in key aspects. So the program is a 9 to 18 months of subsidy. So at the time of the study, this was roughly around $2,200 that the landlords received. In addition to that, the program included things like housing upgrades, mold removal, securing windows. So this was part of the program.
Hello. I think Abed might be frozen for me
Please
and
speak.
perhaps oh, sorry about that, Abed. You froze for a minute there. If you could just go back a little bit to what you were saying.
Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, so the intervention is a 9 to 18 months of free rent, and it's paid to the landlords. It's around $2,200 at the time of the study. And it included things like, housing upgrades, mold removal, securing windows, and things like that. And another key aspect of the study was that the landlords were required to sign a contract with the implementing partner. So this was kind of something that the implementing partner required. And so these households did not really have to move. Part of the study was just upgrading their existing units. And the methodology that we'll be using is called a randomized control trial. And I'll explain that more in a second. The sample is roughly around 16, 19 refugees, and they were split roughly between treatment and control equally. And of course, we care a lot about transparency and economics, and so we have a detailed pre-analysis plan with all the regressions that we will be running and the analyses that we'll be conducting. And so, we have that also publicly available on the American Economic Association registry. So how big is the transfer? This is taken from another paper we have in the Oxford Review for Economic Policy. And the point of this is just to say, in the interest of time, I'll just say that the subsidy is a large amount. So it's roughly twice household income. And it's covering this rent for households for the time that I mentioned, between 8 to 19 months. So what is an RCT? Many of you know this, but just to make sure this is clear, it's a randomized controlled trial or a field experiment. And basically, the way it works is randomly it assigns participants into two groups. One group gets a treatment. In our case, it's the housing subsidy I've been telling you about. And the other group does not get any intervention. And the key is this allocation is done randomly. So you could think in practice in terms of a coin flip or nowadays using software. And the idea is, to be able to get at the causal impact of the program. And it might be also fair because everyone has an equal chance of being selected into the program. And, in that manner, we kind of try to do experiments as much as possible. And, it's considered to be the gold standard for impact evaluation. And there are many other impact evaluation methods that are used, but this is kind of one that we were kind of happy to be able to do. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the context in Jordan. So around March 15, 2011, the Syrian crisis started. And until, the most recent kind of time we were able to get the data, there's been around 14 million people who were displaced from this crisis, 7.4 internally. And as of April 2025, the number is around 550K registered refugees in Jordan. And to give you a sense of how big that is, this is roughly 5% of the Jordanian population. So this is not a small influx of refugees. This is considerable. And then as my colleague Mansi mentioned earlier, around December 8, 2024, the regime collapsed, and then started the formation of interim government, and there's been many things going on since there. So this is just roughly speaking the context in general. Now, why did we even think about this program? What's going on with housing conditions for refugees? There is high housing prices. So one of our co-authors on this project, Sandra Rosso, she has a paper with another co-author looking at the impact of refugee influx in Jordan on housing prices. And they find that when you have areas that attract more refugees, because there is a limited supply stock, so supply of housing is fixed, housing prices go up. So this is the context we are working in. And also based on an implementer survey, many households in our context have rental debt. And the average value is around roughly $500. And many of the refugees report having rental debt. One last thing is, based also on the survey, around 40% of Syrian refugee households in Jordan, which is our context, reported moving at least 3 times per year. And so you could think of this potentially as being either voluntary or involuntary, like eviction. And this shows you the importance of this context. There is high prices, so much debt, and housing instability. And this is where we think this program is helping. So here, just to give you kind of an idea of the context we're working in. So this is a housing unit where refugees. So just to give you an idea of the context, this is a housing unit where the refugees live. And so you can see here, there is this building, the structure, and in the background, you can see there is so many other buildings. This is like from kind of one of the units. You can see here the entrance of the building. And then this is a kitchen from also a refugee housing unit. And you can notice here the stove, the food, things like that. And so these are images that are just, the goal of them is just to show you the context we're operating in so that you can imagine, kind of the situation of the refugee households on the ground. So the study contributions is basically what I mentioned, providing experimental evidence using the randomized experiment. We also will show you impact on attitudes from the natives towards refugees. And finally, I will also show you expert forecasts. So I'm going to show you, look, here is what the experts predicted, and here's what we find. And then hopefully this will help show and shed light on how our results are different from the priors of policymakers. So in the last 3-4 minutes, let me tell you briefly about the timeline and the results. So basically, the program was implemented starting from September 2019 until 2021. And we have 3 rounds of data, which we will be pooling all together for the refugee results. And for the neighbor survey, you see here this light blue, 72%. This is 1 round only from the neighbor survey results. And then we collected forecasts from experts for the results on refugee recipients and also on the neighbors. This is a map of Jordan. In blue, you can see the treatment localities. That's why we call it cluster RCT, because we randomize at the cluster level, which is in this case, a geographic unit, a locality. Think of it like maybe a county here in the US. And this is in North Jordan, and this is the Syrian border north to Jordan. So this is where the study took place. We have many outcomes of interest, primarily housing expenditure and housing quality. Also, we look at total consumption, adult depression, and child socio-emotional well-being. And we have many other outcomes, as I've mentioned, that are detailed in our pre-analysis plan and that we also take a look at. And then finally, we also have other primary outcomes for the neighbors. Remember, I mentioned there is neighbors' attitudes towards refugees, and these are neighbors towards policy, economics, social issues, and altruism. Now, let me show you the results of the program, and then we will wrap up. So the results I'm going to show you are in standard deviation units. And, there is many ways to interpret standard deviation units. One way I personally like to think of is a number that's smaller than 0.1, 0.15 might be small impact. 0.1 to 0.3 might be moderate impact. And then 0.3 and above, this is moderate to large impact. This is one way I think about. And the outcomes that you will see here are from the experts' prediction. So this is what, when we ask the experts, what do you think the impacts of the program will be? And so let me maybe show you the results and then I'll explain them. So here, the blue line is basically the range of that covers sort of uncertainty from the expert predictions, and the blue square is our best guess. It's in this case the median. And basically, you can see from the first outcome, housing quality 4 to 12 months, experts predicted 4 to 12 months after the program, there is a rise in housing quality by around 0.25 standard deviation units. You can see it on the dashed line. So this is, moderate to large impact, perhaps you can interpret it. And they also still think 12 to 18 months, this is the second blue line, there is still positive impact. And then in general, you see most of these lines are to the right of the 0 dashed line, which means for the most part, experts predicted the program will have positive impacts across the board. Now, let me tell you what we actually do find. So now in red, you can see the results of the program. And one key thing to notice is for the first 2 outcomes, what we do find is slightly larger impacts on housing quality compared to what the experts predicted. But these are not necessarily different from each other. The stars here show you the impacts that are different between the blue. So let me say this one more time. So the stars here show you the outcomes that are different between the red and the blue lines. And these are 2 outcomes, housing expenditure and child socio-emotional skills. So what we find is that the child socio-emotional skills are lower in the refugee sample, and the experts predicted the other way around. So that's the opposite of what the experts predicted. And similarly, housing expenditures go down even 12 to 18 months after the program. The experts here, you can see here, they predicted no impact, basically. So what's the point here? and then I'll have one or two more slides. The point is that there is an impact, and this impact is not what the experts predicted. So hopefully we're learning something that's new through this experiment, and we're trying to understand the context. Now, let me skip these impacts, and let me show you the impacts on attitudes towards refugees. So this is the second sample we collected. And similarly, I'm going to show you 3 indices in standard deviation units: policy support, economic perceptions, and social attitudes. And here, across the board, experts said no impact. You see the square, the blue square is centered on 0. It means experts thought, why would a housing program impact attitudes towards refugees? What do we actually find? In general, for 2 of the measures, we find not very different results from the experts, but for the last one, the one with a star, we actually find different impacts. The experts said no impacts, but we actually find is negative impacts from the natives in those areas that are close to the refugee recipients on social attitudes. And I'm happy to talk more in the Q&A about what these indices are and what do they capture. But this is something that we think is novel, and we were able to find thanks to this. So let me discuss and wrap up. So we have found that in summary, the program did well on slight improvements in housing quality, did well also on reducing housing expenditure. So the primary goals of the program, it seems like they have been to some extent achieved. But then we also find that there is increased tension between the natives and the refugee migrants. And one way to interpret this is because these areas are already poor. So the NGO is coming there and giving twice household income to the refugees, and the natives don't get anything. And so we think this is in part explaining the story. And there is also many other things that we can think about. One question that we cannot explore is, how would this be different if it was a cash transfer? So suppose instead of the money going to the landlord, you just gave refugees the money. What would happen? Here I'm citing a few other papers that give you evidence, maybe in Lebanon and other contexts, maybe cash transfers might help better, but it's hard to tell here because we did not do this. So this is what, these are our emails, and this is what my colleague Mansi mentioned earlier. So I hope you found some of those results useful, and I'm happy to clarify in the Q&A on anything that was not clear. And thank you so much for your time and for your careful attention.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Abed and Mansi, for a great presentation. Very interesting findings. We can definitely dig more into them. We have time for about 1 or 2 questions at this point before we move into our second presentation. If anyone from the audience has any questions, please go ahead and use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen if you have a question about the study. And perhaps, okay, I see Rahul has a question. Go ahead, Rahul.
Yeah, thanks so much for that presentation. It was really interesting. Obviously, the context in Jordan for Syrian refugees has changed quite a lot over the years. Aside from obviously housing, things like getting a work permit has been more expensive. And you can say that from the perspective of the government of Jordan, a decreasing interest in the promotion of durable solutions when it comes to the Syrian refugees. Plus, with the prospects of return and gradually more and more returns actually happening, I'm sure there's a lot of push and pull effects that play on the context. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit of thinking about longitudinally over a period of time. How has, from the perspective of Syrian refugees, their ability to pay rent also contributed to their attainment of durable solutions and feeling of safety and security in their place of transit?
Oh, thank you so much, Rahul. Ali, should I take them one by one? I see there is also a few more. Okay. So maybe I'll get this one and then whatever time we have for the others. So thank you so much, Rahul. That's really great question. And I think in terms of the impacts over time, so luckily, like we have multiple rounds of data, so we can see, maybe I can. So you can see here in our timeline, we have one data in September 2020. That's the first data point. We have another data point in September 2021. That's the second round. And then finally, we have, after September 2022, we collected the last round. And so the results I showed you today on refugees' ability to pay, of course, thanks to the program, in and by itself is strongest in the area rounds, and then it declines a little bit over time. We can definitely look at the control group. So we can look at the group that did not get the money and trace over time how much are they paying from their for their rent. I don't have the number right now, but my guess is, given that the study was conducted over 2022, 2020, 2022, there might not be huge changes. It's hard for me to speak to the context right now because we don't have data on what's going on right now in terms of refugee ability to pay their rent. But from anecdotal evidence, at least in Lebanon, I do know from friends and family and others that folks who are struggling in general in those hosting countries are returning. And so maybe this might ease some of these fixed housing stock issues I mentioned earlier, and maybe things might get better. But this is just speculation. It's a little bit hard to know, but this is really, really good question. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Jacques, I see you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. And I really appreciate your presentation for today. My name is Jack Dikas. I'm Congolese by nationality, but a refugee living in Uganda since 2015. We are refugees and we are facing so many challenges about getting how we can get opportunity to go in the study. But I really appreciate your method of work and what you are doing for refugees. Especially, I say that I'm in Uganda, in Kamwenge district, especially in Rwamwanja refugee settlement, where I'm located. But we really appreciate what you are doing, and if possible, you can also give us the chance and those opportunity, because we want also to start to go, because life is not easy due to the cut of funds of USAID, American people, that refugee today we are suffering, and people are looking for what to go to get a small job, a casual labor where you can work. You find people are moving around looking for some opportunity, but it is okay. And I really suggest, if possible, you can give us also that opportunity in Uganda, because I think that I write to you and they will have my email there. We can still in collaboration, because we want also to have those opportunity. It was yesterday for Syrian, but you can give also a chance to Congolese people that are living here and suffering. We have so many youth here. We are in our camp. We are like 10,000 people here, and most of them are youth. We want just to beg you, if you can give us also that chance to go and study. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your presentation for today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jack. Maybe I'll answer the last question, then Ali, we can move to the next presentation. So thanks so much, Jack, for your perspective. And I do know your struggles, and I was even a refugee myself back in the day in Lebanon, like 7-8 years ago. So I sympathize with all of what the refugees are going through, and we will all do our best and try to we can. The money comes essentially. My connection. Okay, the money comes from the funders that we just help them with evaluating these programs. But we will make sure to take note of your email. My colleague Masi and I, we will see what we can do. But thank you so much for your comment, and we really appreciate it. And thanks so much everyone for the questions. I learned a lot from everyone, and I look forward to Juan Pablo's presentation and to the discussion at the end.
Yes, thank you so much, Abed and Jacques. And hopefully one of the outcomes of this discussion is to be able to compare how something like a housing intervention looks like across contexts and what the opportunities are to learn from the different contexts, and how we can then apply similar programs or interventions in other contexts, including places like Uganda. So thank you for raising that. And we hope we can be together to learn from these presenters about how we can adapt in our own spaces. Great, thank you again for the presentation, and looking forward to the discussion after our second presentation. With that, we will go ahead and pass over to Juan Pablo from Blumont to present on the quasi-experimental impact evaluations that they did for rental support for IDPs and migrants in Colombia. Over to you, Juan Pablo.
Thank you, Ali. Thank you, Abed and Nancy, also for taking part of this. And thank you, everybody, for joining this call. So what we want to share is our work that we've been doing since 2021 with rental support interventions for, on one hand, internally displaced women that have just been displaced, and on the other hand, Venezuelan women, refugee and migrant women in host communities in Colombia. So let me just start. Why are we focusing on rental support? So we believe that housing offers a different pathway to self-reliance, durable solutions, and socioeconomic integration of IDPs and migrants. We use several arguments from other organizations, including the independent review of the IASC response to internal displacement. They said that the responses to internal displacement are too often not joined up, unacceptably slow, and that housing tends to be deprioritized, and it's seen largely as a development issue. That's one of the prejudices that we have to struggle with. There's also the progress report by IOM and Georgetown University on progress towards durable solutions, saying, look, adequate housing is associated with less reliance on humanitarian assistance and a more stable income. In fact, they also suggest that women should have preferential access to these type of interventions because of the greater impact on them and their families. Recently, also, the Inter-American Development Bank, the OECD, and UNDP said, look, formal work and education are not the only channels for economic integration. There could be other options, and what we explore is housing as that alternative to formal work and education. And IPA Innovations for Poverty Action, who funded also, if I understand correctly, Abed and Nancy's work, and I think NESA is also joining us. They've been doing a review of impact evaluations, rigorous impact evaluations for the past years. Right now, the current review is at about 47 impact evaluations, of which 37 are on livelihoods. And what they see is that the evidence is mixed at best. So, for example, they see that for business skills training, the programs are either unsuccessful or not cost effective, that there's mixed evidence on cash transfer for employment outcomes, and little empirical evidence of the impact of subsidized employment. So what we also see is that perhaps it's time to start exploring alternatives to the usual livelihoods interventions. Not saying that they don't work anywhere, but probably it's time to try out something different. In the context that we are working on, we have the mix of two different humanitarian situations. One, we have the issue of armed conflict. To give you an idea, in addition to the 10 million victims of armed conflict historically in Colombia, last year 225,000 persons were recently displaced, and just in the first 6 months of this year, 140,000 persons were displaced. Most of these families don't have any access to humanitarian assistance after they've been displaced, and even less families have access to adequate shelter assistance. That is why almost 8 out of 10 of IDPs in Colombia, the new ones and the old ones, do not live in adequate housing, even though 80% of them are living in urban areas in the 10 largest cities of Colombia. In those same cities, you're also getting Venezuelan migrants that have decided to stay here in Colombia. 2.9 million Venezuelans have stayed in the past 5 years in Colombia, most of them in urban areas, and similar needs because 77% do not have adequate housing, 75% cannot afford rent because of the high prices, and whatever rent they are able to pay, they are at risk of eviction. So what we've been doing since 2021 is we started with a prototype of rental support. We tried that out with migrant women under the Acogida program funded by PRM. And then we had other iterations for recently internally displaced women that was funded by USAID and BHA, currently now being funded by the Department of State also for 100 additional families. And those were what we call long-term interventions. They were 9 months for migrant women, 6 months for internally displaced women. Migrant women were very vulnerable, 90% on income poverty. Displaced women were 90% in extreme income poverty, so even worse. Remember that they were just displaced. The goal of the interventions with migrants was self-reliance and social integration. The goal with internally displaced women was stop or avoid dependence on humanitarian assistance and make progress towards durable solutions. But we also have tried out other iterations, more short-term iterations, 3, 4, and 5 months, also with Venezuelan migrants, most of them women, but also men. Not so bad off, 60% were out of income poverty, and the goal was more economic integration. So what we want to share with you today is the two main operations that we've had, the one for the 9 months rental support for migrants and the 6 months rental support for internally displaced women. Although they have different goals, there's common operational features. How do we find these women? Well, we go and do surveys through different mechanisms. And when we do the surveys, we complement it by doing visits to determine if they are pre-eligible. A woman and her family is pre-eligible if they have special needs because of the characteristics of the members of their household. So they get more points if they have a child under 5. They get more points if there's a person with disability and so on. Second, they get more points if they are facing or are at risk of a protection risk. If you were internally displaced because of the risk of forced recruitment of your children, or if you are a migrant woman at risk of sexual exploitation and abuse, you get more points. In fact, you jump the line. And finally, the living conditions. If you live in a place with dirt floors without adequate water or sanitation services, you get more points. And when you are pre-eligible, we offer you rental support, and these women have to confirm that they are interested in this. They may not be interested because they are moving to another city, or the agency is so impacted by forced migration and displacement that they say, but you know what, I'd rather not get it. We sometimes convince them, other times we don't. But if they confirm the interest, then we tell them, look, and we give them a clear signal. We're going to be paying you 9 months if you're a migrant, 6 months if you're an internally displaced woman, of rental support. And that rent will be the rent that you negotiate. On average, it is about $105, but it could be more, it could be less, depending on your needs. But you must find, adequate housing. And that means that you have to find a landlord willing to sign a written contract. There cannot be overcrowding, meaning no more than 3 persons sleeping in the same room. There's got to be access to water, sanitation, and energy services. There has to be adequate privacy, metal or wood doors and windows in bathrooms and bedrooms. And there cannot be any risk of natural disaster. So if these women were able to find these, give me 1 second. Should be better now. My voice is gone. So if these women find this adequate housing, then we give them the 9 months or the 6 months of rent. So it's $105 per month, and we do regular checkups with them to verify that they complied with the living conditions that they must continue to have. And we connect them with additional services. It's not just about cash. So it's 9 months working with these women, 6 months with internally displaced women. So the impact evaluations. So for IDPs, we wanted to test out what were the changes in general ideas of well-being, agency, income, and housing. And for migrants, we included other ideas such as self-reliance and integration, and even tried out some ideas on cognitive function. Our research partner for the IDP evaluation was Causal Design, and we partnered with the Washington University in St. Louis and the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative for the migrant women. Both of them used a quasi-experimental evaluation using a matching methodology. That means that this is not a fully randomized evaluation. We didn't randomize it not because of ethical concerns or anything like that, but because the donor told us just pick the ones that are the most vulnerable and that meet the selection criteria. So at the end, we decided not to randomize that selection and just go with those with that criteria. Of course, it would always be better to do the randomization, but in this case, a quasi-experimental evaluation allows you to infer with enough statistical confidence that the differences between the treatment and the control group are attributable to the rental support. In the treatment group, we have the beneficiaries of rental support. It's 94 families for the IDP evaluation, 426 families for the migrant evaluation. And the control group was made up of women that were just as vulnerable, similar characteristics of members of the household, similar characteristics of living conditions, similar protection risk. But the most important difference is that they didn't get rental support because we just ran out of places. They were living in the same cities, were displaced at a similar moment in time, and so on. Statistically, the matching finds the most similar woman to the most similar beneficiary. So it's, again, the most similar families, so you can see that differences are attributable to rental support with enough statistical confidence. And for the migrant, for the IDP evaluation, we've done data collection 2 months after the end of rental support, 6 months after, and 1 year after the end of rental support. For migrants, we've done it 2 months after, 6 months after, and we are just starting this month to do the 1 year after data collection. 4 concepts have guided our evaluation. Some of them apply more to one or the other, but 4 concepts are sort of like the key concepts of these evaluations. And the first one applies to both. It's the idea of scarcity. So vulnerable refugees and migrants, as well as IDPs, they face exacerbated scarcity. They can only focus on surviving. And because of that, they act only on urgent decisions. The scarcity theory says that they have tunnel vision. They can only focus on surviving. They face scarcity because they lack resources. For example, they lack money or support networks. Remember, IDPs, 90% of them were in extreme income poverty. But most importantly, they face scarcity because they lack capacities. It's because scarcity taxes demand. So, for example, you can see the testimony on the slide, how one woman put it, which is a great way to describe it. She said, we were always dragged down by the worry that the priority is to have a roof over our heads. We were afraid of getting kicked out. So we had to take money away from other things, just surviving, focusing on taking money away from other things to be able to pay rent. Then there's other concepts, the idea of durable solutions. We go with the definition used by the progress report, which simplifies it a bit and says, look, a durable solutions looks like for IDPs as the combination of adequate accommodation, adequate housing, stable jobs, security, and a sense of belonging in their communities. Linked to durable solutions, it's the idea of self-reliance, and we go with the definition of the self-reliance initiative, a household's ability to access resources in a stable way, weathering shocks now and in the future to meet basic needs. And then we also took some concepts of social integration theory, acculturation, discrimination, sense of belonging, and social capital. So let's go to the results. The first question that we most of the times get asked, basically from what I call the skeptics of rental support, is what's going to happen with these women after the end of rental support. So but you'll see always internally displaced women on the right, migrant women on the left. For internally displaced women, 1 year later, 61% of women, of beneficiaries, were able to keep on paying rent on their own in adequate housing. That was 3 times more likely than the control group. So there is a very large effect from rental support in the ability of women to sustain adequate housing, internally displaced women, I mean. For migrant women, again, we only have so far data 6 months after the end of rental support. The results are also very good so far. 95% of beneficiaries are able to keep on paying rent on their own in adequate housing. And remember, the key is adequate housing. It's not just any house. It's got to be adequate housing. Although there's been some improvement also in the control group, the difference is also significantly large. It's a 31% difference. And what's interesting is that by using the self-reliance index, we are able to also measure the scarcity in both groups. And we see that there's greater scarcity in the control group because 60% of them almost, even though they're paying rent in adequate housing, have been behind rent at least 1 month in the past 3 months. So the first conclusion is that rental support is sustainable. It's not only a mechanism to access adequate housing, but also to sustain it. For internally displaced women, is this a path toward durable solutions? Yes, that's also what the data confirms. 1 year later, 80% of women, internally displaced women that is, are feeling safe or very safe where they live, compared to 45% in the control group. In fact, the control group is stuck after displacement. There's also greater sense of belonging. 80% of beneficiaries feel that they belong to the neighborhood where they live, which is 25% more than the control group, which again is stuck. And incomes of the beneficiaries, they multiply 2.4 times, and we didn't do anything on incomes or livelihoods or employment or entrepreneurship. They did it on their own. And these are quality incomes because extreme income poverty fell from 89% to 27%. And now 45% of those women are out of poverty. So rental support is a path toward durable solutions for IDPs. Now, is it a path for self-reliance of migrant women? Yes. Using the Refugee Self-Reliance Index, we confirmed that 6 months later, 94% of beneficiaries had either acceptable, good, or excellent levels of self-reliance, which is much more than 67% in the control group. The self-reliance, the index measures self-reliance on a scale from 1 to 5, 5 being fully self-reliant. The baseline score for beneficiaries was 3.01, and it jumped to 4.04, which is significantly more than the average score for the control group, 3.33, 6 months after the end of rental support. And interestingly, there's significant changes in beneficiaries in domains for which we didn't do anything. So you can see there's better scores on food security, on overall safety, having debt, having savings, which are things we didn't do anything for families. It's just that they were using the greater capacities that they had from rental support. And finally, social integration is also impacted by rental support. Even though the differences are not so large in discrimination, for example, 93% of beneficiaries say that they feel no discrimination or little discrimination at work, which is 9% more than the control group. There's greater sense of belonging also, and the largest difference being in access to social capital, we do see that there continues to be a significant difference between treatment and control in social integration. How does this happen? We explore two mechanisms. How do those, what's the sequencing behind this? So the first thing to explore would be income. So what we see is quite surprising. In the case of IDPs, the income is pretty much exactly the same 1 year later. But despite being the same income, let me go back quickly, you have that 61% of women beneficiaries are paying rent in adequate housing, but just 20% of the control group. So same income, different decisions. And for migrant families, also, the income improved significantly. It doubled 6 months after the end of rental support for beneficiaries. And now beneficiaries have an income 20% higher than the control group. So yes, incomes are better, and even better in some cases comparing the treatment and control group, but it doesn't explain the whole story. It's not just money. It's the peace of mind that comes from having 9 months or 6 months of adequate housing. And we measure it with an instrument called the peace of mind scale. What you see here on the left is that 1 year after the end of rental support, 75% of internally displaced women were telling us that frequently, very frequently, or always, they feel peace of mind. That's 24% more than the control group. And on migrants, 88% of them tell us, or beneficiaries tell us, that they have peace of mind compared to just 55% of the control group. The greater peace of mind allows them to use fully their cognitive capacities and start making the important decisions and come out of that tunnel vision of scarcity. And that is linked to better agency and an overall better evaluation of their subjective well-being. So to conclude, rental support has a large impact in access, of course, to adequate housing, but it also has an impact on maintaining adequate housing even 1 year after the end of the intervention. Because of the peace of mind that comes from rental support during a long enough amount of time, 9 months for migrants, 6 months for IDPs, families are able themselves to improve their capacities, and eventually that leads to better incomes. And because they have better capacities and better incomes, both internally displaced women as well as migrant women are moving forward to self-reliance, durable solutions, and economic integration. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Juan Pablo, for a really fantastic presentation and really exciting results to see across different domains. I saw we have one question in the chat, so maybe we can start with that and then take one more from somebody else on the call. But Abdu said, Juan Pablo, you found that rental support is sustainable after 6 months. What are the factors that lead to such excellent results?
So what we were able to see is that there's one factor, which is time. Rental support most frequently is when you at least when we use data for interventions for migrants in Latin America, for internally displaced persons here in Colombia, you see that at around 3 out of every 4 rental support interventions are just 1, 2, or 3 months. What we were observing in migrant families and in IDPs is that in the first months, the additional disposable income that they had because they were not paying rent went overwhelmingly to pay debt. To give you an idea, right now, the average debt at which families arrive once they are displaced to the cities where we're providing assistance is equivalent to 9 months of rent. So they do have a large debt that they have to pay out. And they need several months to start switching from paying debt to saving and investing. That breaking point is 6 months for migrants, 4 months for IDPs. That's why they need 9 months migrants and 6 months for IDPs. So time is a key factor. It has to be a long enough amount of time so families can enhance their capacity. And the second key factor is that rental support has to be linked to adequate housing. If you, for example, receive that the same cash, or if you get rental support in a place that continues to be overcrowded, in which you don't feel safe, or in which you don't have access to water and sanitation services, the peace of mind hypothesis will not stick, because you're not feeling peace of mind, because you still live in inadequate housing. And this is especially the case for women, which have a much greater burden of care in their families. So it's way harder to take care of a 5-year-old in a place with dirt floors and no water than in a place with adequate housing, enough spaces for the families, and so on.
Absolutely. Those elements definitely could contribute. Jacques, I see you have your hand raised, but I'm going to actually turn over to some of the questions I see in the chat from some people we haven't heard from yet. So it looks like maybe we'll ask one question. Why were the two groups given different periods of rental support?
Very good questions. I'll give you the most direct answer. First one, because we had different donors and we had different time frames on the awards. If I could dream it up, I would have done at least 12 months of rental support initially. But what we were able to do with the 12-month award funded by PRM is that we said, okay, let's do 9 months of rental support. So we have about 1.5 months, 2 months for targeting, and 1 month for final follow-up. So that gave me only 9 months. Then why 6 months and not 9 for IDPs if we had the same time frame of the award? Because the government jumped in on this and said, look, let's just do 6 months, because by the end of the 6th month of displacement, these families should be receiving services from government agencies. That was the hypothesis. It didn't hold at the end, but we did 6 months. Most importantly, what these impact evaluations are telling us is that 6 months is a good enough amount of time for IDPs, and that 9 months is also a good enough amount of time for migrants. If you were to tell me right now, would you do 12 months for IDPs? I would say most likely no. Thank you. I'd rather do twice as much beneficiaries for 6 months than instead of just 12 months for just a regular number of IDPs.
Great. Thank you. I see there is a number of other questions in the chat. We are now moving into our last half hour where we'd love to bring in Abed and Juan Pablo for a joint discussion. So we'll continue to draw on some of the questions in the chat, but I'll also propose some questions to you both to respond to. And one of those, so one of the findings in Abed's first presentation was around attitudes of the host community and how those actually became more negative with the intervention. Meanwhile, in the Colombia study, there was the study that looked at IDPs and migrants. And so I'm curious to hear from both of you. What do you see as the value of engaging host communities, as well as internally displaced peoples, in building this evidence base around effective housing interventions? Where are the challenges and opportunities? And what are these studies kind of telling you about the inclusion of these populations in the evidence building?
I don't know how I will be. I can go first and then, okay, perfect. So that's a really, really good question. And as Juan Pablo was presenting, it also came to my mind, like there is this kind of finding that in a context with, of course, a different context and a different group, we're finding that it looks like there is some tensions in terms of policy attitudes. And then with a different subgroup in Juan Pablo's presentation, we see that if anything, the recipients of the program are actually doing better on multiple dimensions. And I think in our context, like because if you remember, I had like multiple indices, and then each index had different components. So if we focus on the elements that seem to have led to the result we find, and I have it here in the appendix in the slide, there is kind of two key questions that seem to have mattered to this. And I'm just gonna read them. The first one is asking the refugee to, sorry, the neighbors, the native,
Maybe. That's something to look for.
Sorry, go ahead.
asking the natives to list the people, the three main people that they get advice from on financial issues, health issues, personal issues. And then it asks them, from these three, your main kind of points of contact, how many of them are Syrians? And we notice in the treatment group, this is going down. So it's not like everyone is interacting with Syrians list. Remember, we have a randomized experiment, so we are able to compare the treatment and the control. And then the second one that shows up is the question that goes as, do the children in this household have any Syrian refugee friends? And remember, this is a question to the natives, to the Jordanians. And this is also another one where we see a decline. So it looks like the interactions after this program, at least based on our data, it looks like, based on these two elements, the closest friends and the interactions with the children, these are the ones that are showing up in some of the indices that I showed you. Now, it's hard to, of course, extrapolate to many different contexts, but we do speculate that in this context, one key issue that might have played a role in this, which I tried to a little bit allude to earlier, is kind of this dynamic of the saliency of the program, right? If you were to give refugees a cash transfer, maybe it's more discreet. Maybe they will go to the bank and cash it. Maybe there is those smart cards. But then remember, the housing subsidy went to the Jordanian landlord, and the money went to the Jordanian landlord directly, so the refugee did not get the money, and that's by design. And so in this case, we believe this might have led to the program being more salient. And we also see in other contexts, like for example, in Lebanon, when you have refugees given, instead of cash directly, those cards that they have to go to the bank to cash them on some days, we also find that there is, kind of line of Syrians, and then other Lebanese natives come and be like, oh, these refugees are taking our money. So I think the saliency is part of the story. It's hard to know because, we just are just trying to compare these different aspects of the program, but we think this is part of it. And so maybe one last thing to say is, I mean, it's again hard to kind of extrapolate, but I do think if we had a different treatment arm where we had a cash transfer that might have gone to the refugee directly, perhaps we might not have seen those results. It's hard to know. And so this is where I kind of concluded that, in this context, it looks like this aspect is important. And if we insist that we would like to do these kind of housing programs, which are very kind of important, just like Juan Pablo talked earlier about how, in many contexts, these are super, super important programs, then perhaps a better approach, given the nature of the situation in Jordan and many other low-income countries, low middle-income countries, is perhaps engaging the natives more. So, for example, maybe giving them similar amounts, or maybe trying to be careful about how the money is dispersed and things like that. So these are some things that I thought of, and I'm curious, of course, Juan Pablo, in terms of things that you felt like in your context were more impactful in terms of those really great impacts that we see in terms of better social impacts and feeling safe and things like that.
Yeah, I think that there, of course, again, we try to analyze the same phenomena, but it's way different context. One of the things that I would also like to highlight is in the first rounds of acogida back in 2021, 2022, we tested one concept of social integration, which was cultural distance. And after doing that, the testing of that concept, we stopped measuring it because, frankly, there was no cultural distance between Venezuelans and Colombians. So that's sort of like one key feature of the type of context we're working on. And but I have no idea if that would still be the same type of result in Syria and Jordan. Because of that very small to non-significant cultural distance, we use the same resource in both interventions for migrants as well as IDPs, which is something that's in Colombia called the Community Action Board. It's the lowest level community participation mechanism. And we would always have buy-in from those community action boards when we were agglomerating these families in some given neighborhoods. IDPs were more likely to be dispersed around cities, but migrants were told to stay in some sectors of these cities. So, but in both cases, even with greater dispersion or not, community action boards were always a resource. So there would not be any competition, to put it one way, between host communities and displaced persons. Contrary to what Abed was saying, we did have great results from the fact that we paid directly to landlords, because these were very vulnerable landlords still. They had a property to rent, but these were very poor neighborhoods, and they were getting the payments. So we would always have the argument to say, look, with the same amount of money, two families are being benefited. One is the rental support beneficiary, and the other one is the landlord. You could always use that money, and people were happy enough with that. I have seen things that are different, for example, in Peru, where we've tried to test out these interventions, and definitely, apparently, there were different results in Jordan. I wouldn't know why, to be honest. But I think that working with those community action boards has always been a great resource, just to make sure that they know the purpose of the intervention. They know that it is not, to put it one way, favoring one group of beneficiaries at the expense of the host community, of the people that are living there, and that everyone can eventually benefit from this.
Thank you. And I wanted to raise a question from Rahul in the chat around the direct transfers to landlords. And maybe this can go to both of you. Did either of you notice any protection concerns that stemmed from the land property owners abusing this assistance, or perhaps distortions of rental markets? In other words, were there negative effects that you noticed from the direct transfer to the landlords?
Look, Abed, let me jump in first on that. In our case, there were no significant negative effects. First of all, these are very large rental markets. So to give you an idea, we were in Medellin. Medellin has 2 million people. So there's no way that our interventions are going to distort the local rental market. Even in the smallest city, we did rental support, which had about 100,000 persons, inhabitants. There was no effect of our rental support distorting market. And one important thing is that we would always hear from beneficiaries, the community action board. They would tell us, oh, you're going to pay $100 on average per month. Rent is much higher here in this neighborhood. And we told them, let's find out. And eventually, yes, in the same neighborhood, you could still find rent of $200 per month, $300 per month. But women would always converge to the $100 per month average. We had women that found adequate housing for $50 per month, and we had women that found adequate housing for $150 per month. That was the range. The important thing here is that women responded to the clear incentive given to them, saying, I'll give you rent for 9 months or rent for 6 months, and they found the solution with the optimal rental price, to put it one way. And whenever we had property owners or landlords that were abusive, we just told them, great, we'll stop paying you. And we took out that, we told the woman, you know what? Let's find another house and we'll complete the 9 months or we'll complete the 6 months of rental support in another place, So we just get rid of the problem and switch by switching the landlord.
Very interesting. Abed, any reflections on that? Did you find anything similar and different in your context?
Yeah, so that's really interesting, and it's fascinating to see how, you know, the programs in different contexts and with different designs kind of yield interesting results for us all like to learn, and this is very fascinating. I think we tried at some point to measure the general equilibrium effects of these transfers, so like trying to think whether giving the money to the landlords, because if you remember from my map, there were some localities that in blue that got the money, and then those in gray did not get the money. And so we were thinking maybe this led to some reshuffling of housing units, or maybe this impacted housing stock between the treatment and control groups, or maybe this led to negative impacts. We did not find anything that was tangible, and I guess the saturation, quote unquote, of the program. So like, what is the ratio of those who were treated within the locality? It's very small. So it's hard to get discernible impacts on that. But I don't recall, like from the survey and other measures we've collected, that people reported, perhaps the landlords were abusing their power or anything like that. Maybe one thing that stood out to us was, in this context, there is so much debt forgiveness. So in many cases, those refugees talk to the landlord, and then it seems like their rent is forgiven. So we try to hypothesize that perhaps one way in which this worked is the money went to the landlord, but perhaps part of it would have been forgiven anyway. And so, maybe this might have played a role in some of the results we find. And one last thing I'll say is we were like puzzled by the results we find, because I didn't get to talk a lot about this, but we also, like, if we do round by round results, we find in the very, very first round, when the housing subsidy was dispersed, self-reported hunger increases in the refugee group, in the treatment group. And so we were really, really puzzled by this, because when you look at the expenditure measure, there is no impact. When you look at consumption measure, there is no impact. But then when you look at self-reported hunger, which is simply a question, out of the last 7 days, how many days did you go to bed hungry? We noticed there is a rise in this in the treatment group. And then when we try to analyze this more, we actually found that there is kind of endogenous household formation. And by that, I mean those refugee units were receiving adolescent boys from their relatives, perhaps because now the housing unit, if you remember from the design, there is kind of fixing windows, fixing doors. The housing unit now looks nicer. So it's hard to tell again, but we hypothesize part of those negative impacts might have been because of the quote unquote kin tax, those relative refugees bringing those adolescent boys. And then this might have led to some of these initial results. But then when you pool all the rounds, those results dissipate over time. And so that's why we don't kind of dwell on them too much. And so I think these key aspects of the program and knowing the local context, I think this is something that's true in general for any program, for any design, whether it's an experiment or non-experiment, whether it's a housing subsidy or a cash transfer. I think our role as researchers is always to go there and try to understand the context better and try to understand what do people actually want. And in our study, when we collected more data on this later, we find that many of them actually would have preferred a cash transfer based on the survey results. Of course, this is not our program. Like, we are trying to be scientific and evaluate an existing program, but this is just kind of for the audience and for myself, kind of moving forward. I think this is super, super important in terms of designing these programs and hopefully translating those results into policy effects. And maybe I'll just stop here.
And if I may jump in, Ali, regarding what Abed was saying, there's also a question in the chat on what would have happened if we had just given the beneficiaries the full amount of money as a multi-purpose cash transfer. What would do we think that we would have similar results? So our answer would be a clear no, mainly because of two things. Because of the scarcity theory that we were using, we were noticing ever since 2022 that women were framing the changes that they were going through as changes in the peace of mind, the tranquilidad that gave them having adequate housing for a long amount of time. And once we started to collect data on scarcity, we collected, on peace of mind, we started to collect quantitative data with the peace of mind scale, but we were also doing qualitative data collection with focus groups on scarcity. And at the end of those focus groups, we asked them, what were you able to do? What were you not able to do before rental support? What were you feeling? How were you feeling before and after? Just to get a sense of that peace of mind idea in women. But we also always asked them, and at the end, these were 5 focus groups with 100 participants. And the overwhelming, so we asked them at the end, would you have rather received just the full amount of money than the $900 as multi-purpose cash transfer at the beginning? And overwhelmingly, these women were saying no, because I have realized that because of the scarcity that I was facing, and most importantly, because that scarcity was material, because of the high levels of debt that they were having, they would have used the money most likely to pay debt and not to pay adequate housing, have access to household expenses, and so on. Now, we're also collecting data for IDPs, that was for migrant, and now for IDPs, as I mentioned to you, we were testing out this idea and decided to collect data. These are recently displaced families, families that have arrived in the last week to these cities. And we're asking them, do you have any debt? Do you have any savings? And what's your monthly income? And remember, right now, on average, the average debt is equivalent to 7 months of rent. So I do understand the value of multi-purpose cash transfers. I fully understand the hypothesis of giving them people choice, they know better, and so on. Agreed. But you have to check one assumption, that people are really starting from scratch when you give them a multi-purpose cash transfer. Because in our case, they are not starting from scratch. I heard recently from an implementing partner doing multi-purpose cash transfers. They said, well, it's great. If they have they need to pay debt, then just give them the money so they can pay debt. And I told them, look, then that's a whole different intervention. Because if the humanitarian response starts by paying debt, I would rather start by doing something different. So as I'm not saying that cash is not a good modality. I'm just saying that in this context of scarcity, you have to check your assumptions of cash interventions.
Yes, thank you for adding that reflection. The next question, Abed, is for you, which is, can you elaborate a bit on the exit plan of the rental support in your study, if there was any, and how that might have influenced the results that you saw?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really great question. So if understanding the question correctly, by exit plan, I assume what's meant is, once the program is over, is there anything else that was done for these refugees? And maybe Mansi can jump in if she has any other thoughts, but my understanding is no, like the program was done given the limited funding that the implementing partner had. The way it works is they have kind of an index that classifies households based on their vulnerability, based on comprehensive admin data they collect. And then the 10% most vulnerable, they get the program anyway. And so we exclude them from our study so that we have a clean treatment control comparison. And then the 10% least vulnerable, they are excluded from the program anyway by the implementing partner because they think they are least vulnerable. And then among the 80% in the middle, this is where our program was implemented. And my understanding is the implementing partner is doing similar sorts of programs in the region, but I don't know exactly if it's with the same households or new households or how does that work. But the program we are evaluating in this paper, it's basically the 9 to 18 months kind of housing subsidy that was implemented. But it could be that on the ground, maybe there is other things going on. Hopefully this helps a little bit with this question.
Great, thank you. And I see we have about 8 minutes left in the call, so I'll pose kind of a bigger, broader, big picture question to you both, which is in doing these studies and looking at the evidence, in your opinion, should housing be considered a core pillar of humanitarian and development strategies? And what is the potential for it to advance refugee self-reliance? And we'll start with Juan Pablo.
Thank you, Ali. Well, that's precisely the reason why we collected this evidence, to make the case for housing as the starting point of changes in families for greater self-reliance, durable solutions, and integration. I think that most people in the call would agree that if I were to tell you that the theory of change says if displaced persons have a job and they have incomes, and then they have better health services, better education, better houses, and less poverty, then you see, yeah, absolutely, that who's gonna say that it wouldn't go that way? Our point is that we want to pivot that virtuous cycle and start from housings. There's two options to interventions for displaced persons according to the scarcity theory. You can focus on giving them more of the resources that they lack, and the most obvious resource is get them more money, get them a job, get them something that they can do so they can earn an income, or give them greater peace of mind so they enhance their capacities. And the peace of mind comes from adequate housing. So having a house. I feel that in a way, the humanitarian response has gone astray from that early idea of livelihoods as a comprehensive concept. Livelihoods has been boiled down to just a fraction of what it means if you go back to the internal displacement response guiding principle. Livelihoods now is how do they make some money? But it's everything. Do they have a house? Do they have an income? Are they healthy? Do they have a way to educate themselves? And in other cases, housing has been turned into a legal problem. How can you restitute property of housings? So what we see is there's got to be a middle way to it. Housing can be a path to durable solutions, self-reliance, and integration. And families can just, by getting to that starting point, find the solutions on their own.
Great, thank you. Over to you, Abed. Same question.
Thanks, Ali, and thanks, Juan Pablo, for the answer. This is really touching on a very key point in terms of the design of these policies. I feel like it's hard to, I'm going to be kind of touching on the literatures in those areas a little bit. I think from my understanding, there is thin evidence on housing policy in developing countries. So we have seen a lot of work on the US here, like the program I've mentioned, the Moving to Opportunity, where we see great impacts by many authors looking at published in really good outlets and really a lot of work, looking at how when you give kind of individuals the chance to move to better neighborhoods, they are able to climb up the ladder in terms of household income and many other outcomes that these authors examine. So I think housing in general is definitely something important. And even here, for me or Juan Pablo or all of us, like we are all, imagine if we did not have adequate housing, life would be really hard for us. And we shouldn't expect anything else different from the refugees. That said, to me, I always wonder what is the counterfactual? Like, what is when we say we want to implement housing, what is the alternative policy? If the alternative policy is do nothing, then of course, I mean, why would we think, doing nothing is better? As long as, of course, like in my study and our study shows with everyone else, we need to take the local context into account. So this is an important caveat. Now, with the counterfactual policy is something like we're comparing housing to things like water and sanitation or cash transfers or education or livelihood interventions, then it's hard for me to tell because I'm not aware of studies that compare all of these side by side. So I think this is not a kind of clean-cut answer, but I feel like I would be a bit careful to generalize things too much. But I don't want anyone, please, to interpret our findings as evidence against housing policy. Not at all. I mean, our evidence is there is some improvement in these housing conditions, which we document. And we also find those potential tensions with the host community. And then the next natural question is how can we design policies that are suitable for local context and that are effective. I hope this answers the question.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you both so much for these great reflections and for sharing the emerging evidence from both of your contexts. I think, you know, it's the findings are so interesting, and also, as you both shared, really expose some of the gaps that we need to fill with future evidence and future research to ensure that the housings are the most effective that they can be for the populations in these contexts. So thank you both so much again. We will share out these presentations and some other resources after the call, as well as the call recording. So please stay tuned for that. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to reach out to us at the RSRI to continue the conversation. And thank you both again. We hope everyone has a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Ali, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a great week.
Bye.